Order. The hearing is now resumed.
Yes, Mr. Commissioner. So I'm going to highlight a few points now from the provincial evidence, and the details of that are in the original provincial submissions for the most part. The first point then, Mr. Commissioner, is that the Commission selected the riparian area regulation as a topic within the overarching theme of freshwater urbanization effects. So you heard evidence from a panel that included Stacey Wilkerson, the riparian area regulation coordinator for the province since 2007. The panel, as a group, including the two federal DFO witnesses, agreed that professional reliance can work. This being in a context of a discussion about professional reliance difficulties with that have been encountered and that have been voiced. So there have been ongoing discussions there, but the panel all agreed that professional reliance can work. A second point that arose at that hearing, which I'm not going to go into any detail on, but after the hearing, actually, their Yankee case was decided by our Court of Appeal, and that was a case where, amongst other things, the Court of Appeal, I guess on the one hand, interpreted the provincial regulation. The Department of Fisheries was not a party to the case, and the Department of Justice was not counsel in the case. Nonetheless, the court does get into how the riparian area regulation works as a regulation within the provincial framework, and raises some difficulties where, in effect, parts of the framework were not imported into law. It also made comments, again without benefits of submissions from the federal government, about the reactive nature of the Fisheries Act. And so the point I draw from that Yankee case that's maybe of interest in the future sustainability section of the court is that amendments to the Fisheries Act may be important with respect to the riparian area, and they will benefit, and some of the changes to the Fisheries Act will benefit both provincial and federal regulators, because the provincial regulators looking at riparian area, looking to enforcement questions, are driven to the Fisheries Act, and again, that's an area of overlap and cooperation and challenges. So the fact that the province took that to the Court of Appeal shows that the province takes this area and tries to make it work as best it can, and it shows the lengths that the province will go to utilize the riparian area regulation, as well as the difficulties of doing so. And we suggest that amendments to the Fisheries Act, when you look at that, implications that amendments to the Fisheries Act may well be an important thing to do. The panel on pulp and paper and mining effluents demonstrated cooperative federalism in action with overlapping federal and provincial regulations. Our fourth point is that there have been major improvement in pulp mill effluents since 1992, and with respect to mining, the case is that, with one exception, there are no mines in proximity to juvenile sockeye habitat on the Fraser River. Our fifth point deals with municipal wastewater, and the witnesses on that topic were from the federal government and Metro Vancouver. And so those witnesses stressed that both the approval of the liquid waste management plan and the forthcoming federal regulations are major milestones. So again, we're looking at a snapshot. Things are taking place. Much is still to be done. Consistent with the technical reports in my submission, the witness from Metro Vancouver said that the impact on sockeye was negligible given the detailed standards and process that it meets, and there was some cross-examination on that. Gravel removal is a topic that we simply submit is not a significant issue for sockeye salmon. And we dealt with it in more detail in our submissions, but that's it's an issue that the process directed towards you, but we submit in the end that it's not a significant issue for sockeye salmon. There was no evidence that the existing water licensing scheme has caused long-term decline in Fraser River sockeye productivity or the collapse in 2009. The province is undertaking a Water Act modernization process which proposes, among other things, to contain in-stream flow requirements and to require licensing of groundwater extractions of large volumes and all extractions in priority areas. So that's an ongoing development where it's a provincial legislative process that's being undertaken, and there we submit that as a federal commissioner, it would not be appropriate for you to delve in depth into that process or as such. And with respect to forest and logging, the overview point is that they have not had a major impact on sockeye salmon populations. Turning to logging and forestry, that was the subject of a one-day hearing, and it's in some respects it's startling that the hearing was one day, and that I think has something that on the one hand I think reflects the science point of view through the technical reports that logging is not where the industry needs to go. It also posed challenges in advocacy as the participants and counsel and commission counsel focused very intensely a huge amount of evidence into a one-day hearing. And, so the first point is that one of the provincial witnesses is Dr. Peter Czaplinski, has done extensive scientific work over the last 20 years and beyond. And so his evidence was important in putting before you evidence of the reports that he's done, showing that on-the-ground work confirms that things are being done better now than they were in 1995. The science evidence has looked into the problems and the evidence on the ground that neither the mountain pine beetle nor issues with respect to logging and riparian areas has led to that decline. There have been gains made in the 1990s, and the evidence shows that has translated into gains on the ground. That is, that the regulatory work done in the 1990s has demonstrated gains on the ground up to the current research, and these gains are inconsistent with the question of whether the forestry and logging issues caused the 20-year decline. In fact, the evidence shows there's been a marked improvement in the post-harvest stream levels and fish habitat protection compared with pre-1995 forestry management outcomes. With respect to water and in-stream flows, we submit that in-stream flows are important for sockeye, and with climate change, temperature is of key importance. We rely on Mr. Bursey's submission on the summer temperature system on the Camano. Glenn Davidson testified there were a variety of tools now used to deal with in-stream flows, and DFO witnesses acknowledged the important advances with the drought response plan in recent years. Although groundwater has not been a problem to date in terms of causal mechanisms or impacts on sockeye, since groundwater can relate to in-stream flows and temperature, it is a topic of increasing concern. Groundwater is monitored now, and addressing groundwater and other concerns is part of the Water Act modernization process. With respect to positive developments that are important, we submit when you look to the future. We refer briefly to the Thompson River Partnership Monitoring Process in Exhibit 1040. Again, there's involvement of federal government, local government, provincial government, First Nations, and industry, and they coordinated both required and voluntary monitoring. The Okanagan Fish Water Management Tool was referred to as an example of something we call a fish water management tool that's been very beneficial for fish as well as for other uses of water, and the reference there is September 16th, 2011, page 29 and 30. That tool is a computer model developed specifically to help authorities to manage water flows in the Okanagan River in a fish-friendly manner. The model benefits kokanee as well as sockeye salmon, since water levels in Okanagan Lake are fine-tuned at the same time as the Okanagan River flows. So it's a computer model that balances between needs, uses real-time data, incorporates biophysical models, and is developed collaboratively by a working group based on historical data-intensive fieldwork. The predictions allow a multidisciplinary team of decision makers to choose the best option for releasing flows in a manner which will benefit fish while respecting the needs of other water users. It utilizes the most current data on potential impacts from various water supply release scenarios on the full range of water users, fish, domestic irrigation, and recreation. The tool has resulted in a much more balanced approach in managing water, fully recognizes ecosystem values and needs, and has resulted in significant gains for both kokanee in the lake, more stable water levels during the kokanee shore spawning period, as well as sockeye and kokonogin in the river and the lake, improved spawning, incubation, and rearing conditions. So, Mr. Commissioner, this is a positive example of input, and I think I'm out of time, but I'll simply refer you to the acknowledgements page in Exhibit 1969, which in itself is inspiring. So, Mr. Commissioner, we wish to thank you, our client, and the other participants in their council for the opportunity to participate in this fascinating inquiry into the iconic sockeye salmon and its cultural, environmental, and socioeconomic importance to the people and the province of British Columbia. The province's recommendations and evidence focused on the importance of an inclusive fishery that involves all of the participants in the fishery and fosters relationships of trust and respect. We have focused on examples of successful integrated processes where professionals and others are collaborating for the greater good of the fish and the people. The province's witnesses have included dedicated professionals with a wide variety of different backgrounds and experience. Other dedicated professionals have been called by other participants. We live in an era where fish habitat and the environment are necessarily reliant on professionals with integrity and good judgment. And in conclusion, Mr. Commissioner, I'd like to specifically thank the different teams of Commission Council because of the wide variety of topics we've dealt with. We've dealt with quite a few of them, some of whom have played a prominent role in the hearings, and others of whom have more commonly been in the background. But all of them we have found dedicated, very cooperative, and very good to deal with, and we appreciate them for that. So those are my submissions, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Klaus.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. It's Chris Buchanan on behalf of the Public Service Alliance of Canada, BC Region, and the Union of Environmental Workers, BC component. We've been allotted 20 minutes, which we intend to use most, if not all, of that time. Unfortunately, such a short time does not allow us to go in any detail over our written submissions, both our initial submissions and our reply. Undoubtedly, you will have an opportunity to review those in detail as you will with the other participants. It will allow us to focus on three primary issues of importance to our clients, and that is first, the financial issues in the budget of the DFO in the Pacific region; two, the issue of devolution of federal authority and capacity, by which we mean co-management and those related issues; and three, it'll allow us to deal with the wild salmon policy, and in particular the draft report on the performance of the federal government with respect to the WSP. The first of those three areas, it may be helpful to give just a little bit of background of my client and who it represents, since we haven't been too active a participant. The PSAC represents the majority of workers in the DFO, both nationally and within the Pacific region. They are the ones that day in, day out work on behalf of Canadians to conserve and protect the gift of the Fraser River sockeye salmon. They essentially include all of the employees except for the managers and some of the professionals such as the scientists. They are the individuals who work in the dozens of offices throughout the region. They work in the laboratories and they work in the field. To many Canadians, they are the face of the department. They are the ones that they call, ask for assistance, and seek information. With that in mind, we would ask that you be careful in drafting your report, that you do not inadvertently place blame or criticism at the feet of the workers of the department. Undoubtedly, there will be many people arguing that DFO has fallen short of its obligations and commitments, but we say that criticism lies at the feet of the top officials who direct policy and are responsible for the implementation of the policy, and not of the individual workers who are following their direction. And in fact, the evidence before you was fairly clear that there are no current problems with respect to individual employees and how they perform their duties. We are seeking in our standing a very limited basis, and that was to do with DFO policies and procedures. The PSAC has made limited recommendations and has not weighed in on some of the more contentious areas such as aquaculture. And it's done so intentionally, not because these areas aren't important and not because the PSAC doesn't have something to contribute to them. It did so expressly so as not to place its members in perceived conflicts when they enforce the regulations and deal with the participants who they deal with on a daily basis. We didn't want to have any of the participants feel that the PSAC had a horse in the race and was somehow prejudice its members in how they were to carry out their duties. We turn now to the first of the three issues, and that is the financial and budgeting issues. Those are found at pages 9 to 21 of our written submissions. And we say that there is an imminent financial crisis that will befall the DFO unless there's a change in government priorities, whether that comes about through this report or through public pressure. And that there is presently a 25% reduction in anticipated expenditures, and depending on the outcome of the strategic review and operating initiative, that could be as high as 33%. And as a necessary corollary of that, we say that you cannot take for granted that the existing programs and services that you've heard so much about over the past year, and in fact over the past 2 years, will remain in place without some change in priorities. Turning to the budget. And Mr. Lund has put up my written submissions. Before I go to those, I'd ask that you put up Exhibit 1922 and specifically page 17. And this is the 2011-2012 planning and priorities of the DFO. And if you could just focus in on the bottom chart, you'll see that the forecasted spending of last fiscal year was slightly over $2 billion, and the forecasted spending over the next several years diminishes to $1.587 billion by 2013-2014. Now, this is the document that's tabled in Parliament and which forms the basis of the supply and estimates, and is the budget unless something is changed, unless there's a political will or political priority to increase funds or to reallocate funds away. We are very careful in our written submissions to not suggest that these numbers are submitted in concrete. They can change, and they may change, and we hope that they do change. But they can change down as much as they can change up. You heard that shortly after this was tabled, the government tabled the strategic review, which resulted in a 3% reduction over the same period of time, resulting in, by 2013, a $56 million reduction to the DFO. And if you can pull up our submission now, at the bottom of the page, I've reproduced Exhibit 1922 as it's stated, and then at the top of the next page, I've taken the document marked for identification PPP, which set out the various reductions per year and have added them into the overall department numbers. And so you see, once you take into account the strategic review, that the number goes down to 1.530 billion. Now, there's a suggestion from Canada in its written submissions, you'll see this in pages 8 and 9 of its reply submissions, that we have our numbers wrong, and that there isn't this, for at least presently scheduled, significant reduction. And with the greatest respect to my friend, we've reviewed the numbers and the evidence, and unfortunately, the Government of Canada is wrong. That these are the projected numbers that currently exist. Ms. Dansrow, when I put to her the 25% reduction, indicated some desire and hope that the government would reallocate funds from sunsetting programs in other departments to the DFO. And so I asked her the follow-up question, which is, has the Treasury Board assured you that you would get more money? And the transcripts will show, it's September 26, page 30, lines 11 to 17, that her answer was no. The government hasn't provided such assurances. So while we're all hopeful that the numbers may go up, we cannot rely on that. We now also know about the Strategic and Operating Review Initiative. And I put to Ms. Dansrow, and you'll see this in the transcript of page 29, lines 14 to 17, whether the Strategic and Operating Review numbers would be based upon what's in the Planning and Priorities document, and she said that they would be. And that, of course, is the review by which the department had to prepare budgets based on a 5% and a 10% reduction. And so we've put in, and this is at page 10, a chart that reflects, keep going down, this one, a 10% reduction that may result from the Strategic and Operating Review. And we see that there can be no assurances that the present $2 billion or $1.8 billion will continue in the foreseeable future. We submit that this budget review process is not an idle process. Government doesn't do these types of activities without some anticipation that they may act on some of the initiatives. And in fact, when the government hives off a large portion of its budget from reductions such as it has here with health and education, it means there's a disproportionate amount of reductions that have to come from other departments like the DFO. So this is a troubling picture and cause for some concern. But we are optimistic that your report can influence the future. I feel a bit like the third ghost in A Christmas Carol. I'm showing you the future as it will be unless there's a different decision made. And that is the role that we would urge upon this commission, to recommend stable funding for the DFO, to recommend that there be no decrease in existing federal capacity and resources, and in fact, to recommend some specific additions to specific areas as we've set out in our submission. And it really is, this is a particularly beneficial time, because unlike the prior commissions who've had to dissect the harmful impact of budgetary reductions, this commission has an opportunity to stop and in fact, influence the change. The other element of the finance that I'll deal with just briefly is we've made a recommendation that the budget reductions dealing with Environment Canada not touch upon the DFO and specifically the Pacific region. The Government of Canada, in its written submission, says that the basis of our recommendations is without evidentiary foundation. And to that we say simply this, is when we put the question of the 11% reduction of positions in Environment Canada, the Government of Canada did not object to a lack of evidentiary basis for our question. We're now prejudiced by the late objection. But you don't need to decide whether the reduction is 11%, 5%. All we are asking, you'll find this in our recommendations, is that any reductions by Environment Canada not touch upon federal capacity with respect to the Pacific region. And this is an area of significant disagreement among the participants over the issue of devolution of federal authority. The present model has the federal government undertaking considerable consultation and collaboration with First Nations and other groups. Some parties before you suggest that the funds used for such consultations are wasteful, and we don't share that view. But more importantly, some participants before you are taking the position that the present model doesn't adequately account for their right to be involved in decision making. What we say to this, Mr. Commissioner, is that the extent of Aboriginal rights is of great debate among the participants, as is whether or not you ought to entertain that debate. The PSAC takes no position on either of those 2 points. But what we do say is that the participants who've advocated for co-management have not put forward an actual model and explain how that model would work in theory and in practice before suggesting such a dramatic paradigm shift. And the First Nations Coalition expressly refers to what they're advocating as a paradigm shift. One would have thought that somebody would have explained what the body would be, who would be on that body, what the decision-making process would be, what the dispute mechanism for resolving disputes would be, and how the body could make timely decisions as fish habitat and fish management decisions must be made. For example, in-season decisions that need to be made in a matter of hours. And none of them say how the model would fulfill Canada's obligations to international treaties as well as its provincial obligations. We further say that it does not make sense that one should experiment with new paradigm shifts with the Fraser River sockeye salmon. That is too important of a resource and too complex and too delicate to allow for kind of a laboratory experiment to see whether the new model would be better. Finally, there's a suggestion that there needs to be a new model in order for better buy-in. And what we say in our written closings at this point is that the problem doesn't seem to be that the present model doesn't account for appropriate buy-in. The difficulty is that some of the participants believe they have better rights than the present model presently provides. That they believe they have the rights to co-manage or jointly decide. And it's then not surprising that the present model is unsatisfactory and may lead to some concern about whether or not it's an appropriate model. But once you step back, once everybody has a common understanding of the rights and responsibilities of the various parties, that we say that the present model should provide for adequate buy-in for all. And finally, on the co-management, we say that none of the proposals demonstrates that the new systems are as effective, efficient, reliable, and trustworthy as the system as it presently is. I guess I'm reminded of the phrase that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. It may be that the present system is the worst form except for all the others. We are, of course, hopeful that your recommendations will help improve the present model. The third area is the wild salmon policy. In our written closings, that there was not a sufficient political will and resources devoted to the implementation of the wild salmon policy. The belief that such a transformative policy could be implemented without increasing resources and without designating a specific person ensuring for the implementation essentially made it so that the policy could not be accomplished. And we expressly adopt the findings, recognizing that they're still in draft form, of Exhibit 1992, which was entered in on Friday. And we particularly adopt the main findings at I to double I, in which they indicate that the progress has been slow, the region lacks resources, and there's a lack of plan led to compromised progress. And we specifically adopt the recommendations found at III to I4, in particular recommendations 1, 2, 3, and 4. And recommendations 1, as you'll see, Mr. Commissioner, is that the WSP needs a firm commitment and funding. Recommendation number 2 is that they need to identify priorities, action steps, and target resources strategically. Number 3, that there needs to be a formal implementation plan. And number 4, that make a senior manager accountable for the implementation. Simply put, the evidence has demonstrated that the RDG has too much on her plate to specifically ensure the implementation of the WSP rather. With the minute or two I have left, Mr. Commissioner, we go back again to the finances and say we adopt the submissions of Mr. Rosenblum and Ms. Pacey, that most of the problems identified in these proceedings with respect to the DFO are attributable to one source, and that's the lack of funding. And we recognize that money alone cannot solve the problem, but we know that this problem cannot be solved without more money. One point of clarification, if I can just take you to page 4 of our recommendations. And clearly late at night, grammar was not my strong suit, and I simply want to correct for the record what that recommendation is. Given the incredible demand on the department and its employees, no additional responsibilities or duties ought to be imposed without a correlating increase in the department's resources. So just again, given the incredible demand on the department and its employees, no additional responsibilities or duties ought to be imposed without a correlating increase in the department resources. So to conclude, Mr. Commissioner, I'd like to thank you for your time and your attention and your due consideration for our submissions. I'd like to thank the Commission staff, both lawyers and particularly non-lawyers, who've worked very hard and are very punctual in getting back to the parties, and they've been a great assistance to us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. My name is David Bursey. I'm counsel for Rio Tinto Alcan. I'll be brief, which is probably wise given that I'm probably the last person standing before the people in the room and lunch. So Rio Tinto Alcan filed a written submission on October 17th, and we rely on that submission. I only have a couple of brief comments this morning which arise out of the reply submissions. Rio Tinto Alcan did not file a reply submission because there was nothing in the main submissions to reply to. But in the reply submissions, Canada filed some comments on what we'd filed in our main submission. And there's a couple of points of clarification that they wish to make. This is on page 11 of their reply submission. Rather than get into the details, I'll just say that we've gone back and looked at the transcript references that we referred to. We're both referring to the same transcript references from the testimony of Dr. McDonald on September 15th. We think what we said in our original submission on October 17th is fair and accurate, and we ask that the Commission just review those transcript references which we have provided, and we think you'll come to the same conclusion. And that's all we have to say rather than get into the details, because they are rather small points. We'd also like to thank the Commission staff for their assistance throughout this process. There was an awful lot of work behind the scenes that have made this process much more efficient than it would have been otherwise. And also thank you for your time.
Mr. Commissioner, for the record, Alan Blair, appearing with my co-counsel Shane Hopkins-Utter for the BC Salmon Farmers Association. I will echo the remarks that you've heard from some of the previous counsel with respect to the courtesies that we've all been extended from Commission staff, the lawyers and the staff who have helped manage the vast resources that have been required, including hundreds of thousands of pages of documents, much of it technical in nature. So we certainly echo those remarks of appreciation. My client appears before this Commission in a somewhat unique position. Mr. Prose for the province was remarking how 1 day was adequate for logging, and I heard the hesitation in his voice and heard the remarks about an endeavor in British Columbia which has been going on for so long as logging has been, with its obvious impact on water ecosystems up and down the coast, received today. That's not a criticism, but that's just to remark that the scope of this inquiry is indeed very, very large. Somewhat more topical, apparently, are the activities of my client, and certainly they've received and continue to receive attention both within the Commission and outside the Commission. I do want to, at the outset, just remark about what an opportunity all British Columbians and indeed Canadians have to be able to participate in such a forum as this Commission of Inquiry on as contentious an industry as the aquaculture industry has become. And in particular, and this has been evident to my client from the beginning of this process, industry groups have a difficult time winning the wars in the blogs and web pages and newspaper columns where fact and fiction merge seamlessly. Courtrooms and inquiries where witnesses are required to take the stand and affirm or swear to tell the truth provide an entirely different quality of evidence. And my client has had the great benefit, indeed British Columbians have had the great benefit, of taking some of the mystery around this industry and pushing it back into the shadows. And we thank the Commission for providing that opportunity. We are at the end of a very long inquiry, and aquaculture has been a thread which has woven its way through much of it, including its own special section. And we believe, and you'll hear from our submissions, both oral and written, that we think the evidence really establishes quite clearly that aquaculture plays a very low, if any, impact on the terms of reference question, central question, regarding whether or not it contributed to the decline of the Fraser River sockeye salmon. I owe a great debt of gratitude to my associate who I've mentioned, Mr. Shane Hopkins-Utter, who was fundamentally instructive in helping produce the submissions that we've prepared with the assistance of some technical people that we had in the background. And as I believe Counsel for Rio Tinto Alcan just said, we rely on our submissions, although I will go into them in somewhat greater detail given the more central responsibility that this industry has before this Commission. I don't require Mr. Lund to put up on the screen, although I'm certainly happy to do so if the Commission wishes to see a particular passage that I'm referring to, but I don't need to have him go onto the screen, and that's because I intend to proceed with some speed through the 150 pages of written final submissions and a lengthy, almost 80-page written argument in reply. But I will just outline again what we intend to cover very orally. We will spend a very brief period of time talking about the factors which we think are most likely to have caused the decline, overall declines, and in particular the event of 2009. And again, I think it's fair to say that most of the parties here do recognize that the factors that we've listed in our written argument, including climate change and the marine environment, food abundance, harmful algal blooms, and predation, certainly rank right up there amongst the evidence that the Commission has heard with respect to factors which are most likely to have contributed to the overall decline. And you recall the evidence when Dr. Beamish and others were on the stand, they were talking about the double whammy or the triple whammy, and it seems fairly central that the effects in the marine environment in 2007 for the out-migrating salmon, which returned in such low numbers in 2009, really presented a very unique and challenging set of circumstances for the young coho, sockeye, and perhaps coho, sockeye, that were migrating out to the North Pacific. So we'll touch on those very, very briefly because I think there's very large agreement that they were most relevant to your inquiry. We'll discuss in somewhat greater detail, Mr. Commissioner, the precautionary approach to regulation and management of our industry. And we will describe it, as we have in our written submissions, as informing the debate on the precautionary approach. The precautionary approach with adaptive management is the way in which this industry, and indeed most industries in Canada, are in fact regulated. And people often confuse the precautionary approach and adaptive management with a precautionary principle, seeming to believe that precautionary principle means anything which can impact an environmental ecosystem must be stopped at all costs. And that is not what aquaculture is. That is not how aquaculture is managed and regulated, nor other industries. There's a precautionary approach and adaptive management, and I'll get into that in some detail in what we've described as defining the precautionary approach. We'll discuss that specifically with respect to aquaculture from a management and regulation perspective, the effect of the transition between the province and the federal government, and some other areas. We then will speak about the reliability of the farm data and the provincial audit program, which has been underway now for many, many years. Without getting to it in too great a detail, Mr. Commissioner will recall the order for 120 farms of data going back a number of years, and that data was described by Dr. Corman as impressive and robust. And indeed, I submit to you, given the information that the Commission staff and yourself and the participants had an opportunity to review, one can conclude that characterization by Dr. Corman is fair. Of course, DFO Science and Management has touched on every issue that you've heard pretty well, and it certainly touches on our issue more so now because of the Morton decision and the increased role that DFO plays. And so we'll discuss that relationship between DFO Science Management and our industry. We'll discuss briefly the issue around closed containment and coordinated fallowing, in part because I think it's fairly clear that closed containment is an idea that has not yet reached fruition. It's not economically feasible. You've heard that in terms of viva voce evidence from some of the witnesses and some of the reports that were produced. Coordinated fallowing has also been experimented with in certain areas, really commencing back in the Broughton Archipelago when there were some sensational claims that the pink salmon were declining to extinction in the early 2000s, a claim which has proven out to be sensational and false. But it did provide an opportunity for looking at the idea of coordinated fallowing. And we have references in our written submissions from Dr. Succeed in particular, who can discuss the effect of that. Of course, many people are wanting to know about the central issue of protection of wild salmon on the migration route, and centrally what, if any, role BC aquaculture industry plays in that regard. It would be a useful place to start, and we'll go in some detail, but we commend to your reading our summary of the overview of Project 5 reports. I think perhaps one of the most startling parts of this long journey for all of us was that Drs. Noakes and Dill, who certainly approach aquaculture and even the science around aquaculture from different points of view, that's perhaps being polite in terms of the scientific disagreement that they may share. They were certainly polite to each other, understanding they ought to have been, but they approached that issue from two very different positions, and yet they were largely in agreement with respect to the many of the impacts or lack thereof of aquaculture, and we'll address that in some brief detail. There was what I think Mr. Martland referred to as the tennis match or the ping pong match of the Noakes-Connors back and forth as they both looked at each other's assessment, and I will strip that down in some detail to why it is that we say Dr. Noakes' evidence ought to be preferred over the conclusions reached by Dr. Connors. Farm siting and the protection of the migratory route is, of course, central to how the BC aquaculture industry operates. Each farm is selected by way of a site application, which is thorough. It's expensive. The aquaculture industry provides lots of opportunity for public input. There's a federal provincial role, SIA screenings. It's really a very, very complex arrangement to get a farm sited and permitted. And then we'll discuss briefly how, once it's in place, there's continuing monitoring by various parties, federal and provincial governments, the industry itself, and indeed we'll touch briefly on the ISO certification, which was described by Mr. Bachman as a third tier of monitoring. You've heard, perhaps all of us who are not scientists in the room have heard about fish health management plans, or FHMPs, their purpose and their central role in managing the industry. it was, I'm going to make a couple of anecdotal references to the evidence, and really one is related to the panel that you heard. On the panel was Mr. Schwarzenegger, and then three fish professionals, Dr. Shepard for the federal government, Dr. Marty for the province, and Dr. McKenzie from the industry. And they were discussing fish health management plans and fish health generally. These are generally recognized, those latter three, as the three veterinarians, fish health professionals who are most closely able to discuss and relate to the disease profile of the fish health database from their perspectives of government and within industry. I don't recall exactly the amount of time that each participant was given, but it was striking to me that with these three individuals on the stand and with the fish health database, which was before all counsel, the cross-examination by some of our most vigorous opponents hardly touched those central issues. One needs to go back into the transcript and just see how little actual hard questioning on the fish health data plan was put to those individuals by our most vigorous opponents. And why was that? Well, because the fish health data plan, according to fish health database, according to Dr. Corman, was impressive and robust. And when faced with evidence under oath and questions which would be here and answers forever, our opponents steered well clear of challenging those witnesses on the hard numbers. There was an idea floated that marine anemia might have played some role, and we saw the fictitious 8-quarter graph table Ms. Morton produced, and of course that was just a mere typing error, but it speaks to the issue of just how fanciful the attacks were with respect to Conville Bay and marine anemia. And putting up on the slide some reference that marine anemia was the smoking gun. Here we found it in Discovery Island. Was really put to rest completely when those witnesses explained to the commission the harvesting profile of those particular sites. And you may recall, it's certainly in the evidence, that the site was harvested by the time the migrating sockeye salmon were going out in the spring of 2007. That the Conville Bay Chinook site harvesting commenced in the late fall, November of 2006, and that the site, I'm going from memory, had approximately 3,000 tons, and the very last harvesting was in May, and was a mere 87 tons left in the sites in May, about the time the fish were migrating out. And yet the suggestion put to the witnesses, other than the ones most able to answer those questions, were that, aha, we have it, we've got marine anemia in Chinook in Discovery Passage. So that was the one anecdotal reference to when you've got the right experts on the right topics in front of you, why don't you ask the right questions? Well, because you don't want the wrong answers. The other example I'm going to speak of was when we had Dr. Saxida and others on the sea lice panel. Now, sea lice may have started it all. When you stop and think about the notoriety this industry has received at the activists, not academics, but the activists' pronouncements and then sensational press conferences, it was all about sea lice and the pinks and the Broughton. And yet when we finally get now, today, to 2011, then we hear Noakes and Dill agreeing that the sea lice plays a minor, if any, role at all, other than Dill has a little caveat about whether it might possibly act as a vector, and I'll speak on that if I have time. But we have Dr. Saxida, who is an expert, an internationally recognized expert, and counsel for the Aquaculture Coalition, who had 30 minutes to talk to Dr. Saxida about sea lice. The reason why aquaculture might be receiving as much attention as it is 10 years after it first received that fame in 2001 or thereabouts. 20 of the 30 minutes were spent on wondering who was on her board of directors at her Canadian Aquatic Health Sciences Centre. 20 of the 30 minutes. And she kept indicating to the commission that she had directors from industry and directors from government, and there were even some NGOs who were there. And rather than asking Dr. Saxida the tough questions about sea lice, a world-recognized expert, we debated whether or not she had a balanced board. And I know it's 12:30, so perhaps it's the original time to break.
The hearing's now adjourned. The hearing's now adjourned until 2 p.m.